You don't belong here anymore, Dad. This house isn't yours. It never was. Those words hit me harder than any punch I've ever taken. I was standing in the kitchen of my own home in Cedar Falls, Iowa, watching my only son, Jacob, smirk, like he'd just won a championship. His wife, Laura, leaned against the counter with that smug grin, the one I'd learned to fear over the years. My daughter-in-law had always wanted more than she could earn. My son. He had always been weak in front of her. I had built this house from the ground up. Literally. Every morning at 5 a.m., I'd be at the lumber yard, hammer in hand, boots caked with mud from the Midwest rains. I'd spent decades running the diner on Main Street, paying off mortgages, helping neighbors, doing what a man did to keep his family afloat. And now? My own blood had turned against me. I sank into the worn leather chair by the window, watching the autumn leaves fall across our yard. The smell of burnt coffee still lingered from my early morning brew. Cedar Falls was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that made betrayals feel louder. I could hear the faint ticking of the kitchen clock, each second mocking me. "Jacob, you can't just say that," I said, my voice trembling, but trying to sound calm. "The deed. It's still in my name." His smirk didn't falter. "Deed, Schmied? You're old, Dad. It's time to hand things over to people who actually know how to run a house, a life, a family." And just like that, I felt it. The sting of rejection, of humiliation. My own son had reduced me to a guest in my home, a relic of the past. The diner, the mortgage payments, the countless nights I stayed awake worrying about their future. It all seemed meaningless now. Before I continue, if you're new here, please like, comment, and subscribe. And tell us where you're watching from. I had always tried to be a good father. I remember holding Jacob in my arms the night he was born, feeling the weight of responsibility and hope. I taught him how to ride a bike down our street, coached his little league teams, stayed up late helping him with school projects, even when my hands were raw from working at the diner. Yet here I was, being told I had no place, no voice, no value. The betrayal cut deeper than any injury. And I realized something chilling. It wasn't just Jacob. Laura had been shaping him, whispering doubt into his ears for years, turning him against me in subtle, poisonous ways. I poured myself another cup of coffee, the steam curling up like the smoke of my rising anger. Cedar Falls was full of gossip, and I knew people would hear about this. But I wasn't going to let them dictate how I reacted. I was going to think carefully, move carefully. And I was going to make sure that, when the time came, everyone saw the truth. Because if they thought this was the end, they were dead wrong. Somewhere deep down, I felt the first spark of a plan forming. It would have to be patient, quiet, and thorough. There were lawyers, banks, mortgages, and small town. Rules that could all be used in my favor if I played it right. But more than that, there was justice, poetic justice, that I intended to serve. I took a deep breath, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. I would not lash out impulsively. I had spent a lifetime thinking ahead, calculating risks, and staying one step ahead of trouble. This would be no different. Yet even as I sat there, the autumn wind rattling the windows, I knew that the moment when Jacob and Laura realized they had underestimated me was approaching. Soon, very soon, the balance would shift. And when it did, they wouldn't know what hit them. But for now, I had to wait. I had to watch. I had to prepare. and I had to survive the humiliation that had been thrown at me this morning. Because if they thought this was the final chapter, they were wrong. Seriously, Dad, why are you even standing there? Go fix yourself a snack or something. This isn't your space anymore. Jacob's words cut like glass, sharper than anything I'd heard from him before. Laura laughed from across the kitchen, her voice ringing with the kind of cruelty that felt rehearsed. Every corner of my home, every creak of the floorboards, felt like a reminder that I was no longer welcome. I gritted my teeth and forced myself to stay calm. Cedar Falls was a small town. Gossip traveled faster than the speed of the wind in late October. If I reacted rashly, I'd only give them more ammunition. I had to be strategic. Patience had always been my strength, and right now, it would be my weapon. Jacob, you think this gives you power? I said quietly. But you're forgetting something. I built this place with my own hands. Every nail, every brick, every mortgage payment I ever made. My voice trailed off as I felt the weight of disbelief in the air. He shrugged, leaning against the kitchen island with that infuriating smirk. Yeah, okay, Dad. Congrats on the hard work. But this is 2025, not 1985. Things move on. You should too. The betrayal wasn't just in words. It was in their eyes, the way they looked at me as though I were a stranger. I had been the one to guide Jacob through every milestone. But somehow, the lessons had been twisted, poisoned by Laura's influence. I left the kitchen and walked down the hallway, past the framed photos of family vacations, birthday parties, and old memories of laughter. Every photo was a story of what had been, a past that now seemed like it belonged to someone else. I felt a mix of anger and sorrow, an ache that had nothing to do with my physical body. I had to remind myself, this wasn't the end. The law, the system, and my own careful planning were on my side. The deed to the house was still in my name. The bank statements, the mortgage records, the years of receipts, all proof that I had sacrificed every penny, every ounce of energy, for the family that was now turning on me. Yet their arrogance blinded them. They assumed that my silence meant weakness. They thought I would crumble, that I would let them rewrite history and erase my contributions. That evening, as I sat alone in my study, the sound of the wind rattling the old window panes, I made a decision. I wouldn't let them get away with it. I wouldn't allow years of hard work, sweat, and late nights to vanish into thin air. And I realized something crucial. Revenge doesn't have to be loud. It can be quiet, methodical, and devastatingly effective. I began reviewing old documents, mortgage papers, bank statements, and deeds. Each piece of paper was a weapon. Each signature a potential strike against the arrogance of those who had tried to humiliate me. Cedar Falls had its ways, and I knew the system could be manipulated if handled carefully. But revenge wasn't about money alone. It was about dignity, about reclaiming a sense of self that Jacob and Laura had tried to strip away. I pictured the day when their smug faces would falter, when the community would see the truth, when their laughter would be replaced by shock. That day was coming. Still, I had to tread carefully. One wrong move, and the balance of power could tip against me. I needed a plan that was airtight, involving lawyers who could navigate small-town bureaucracy, banks that I'd dealt with for decades, and even the unsuspecting neighbors who would unknowingly become part of the story. As night fell, I poured another cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker in the darkness. Jacob and Laura were upstairs, probably plotting their next insult, assuming they had already won. They didn't know that I had already started turning the pieces on the board, arranging a quiet, unstoppable checkmate. And somewhere deep inside, I felt the first thrill of anticipation. Poetic justice was never instantaneous. It was a slow burn. But when it came, it would leave no doubt. I had been wronged, and I would be righted. The next morning, I would step into their world again, not as a defeated father, but as a calculated force they had never anticipated. I never thought I'd feel exhilaration in the quiet of my own kitchen, but as I spread the mortgage papers, bank statements, and legal documents across the table, I did. The smell of ink and paper mixed with the faint aroma of my morning coffee, a small comfort as I plotted the comeback I had dreamed of for weeks. Jacob and Laura believed they had already won. They thought my silence and slow, deliberate steps were signs of weakness. But I had learned long ago that patience is more powerful than anger, and strategy far more potent than impulsive rage. Started by calling Mr. Hawkins, the lawyer I'd known since I bought the diner 30 years ago. His office in downtown Cedar Falls was small, but his reputation was solid. He didn't let arrogance win, and he didn't miss a single detail. "Mr. Reynolds," he said on the phone, voice calm, measured. "I've got the documents. Everything's in order for a quiet reclamation. Are you sure you want to proceed this way?" "I'm sure," I replied, my voice steady. "No drama, no shouting, just the facts. They think they can erase me. I'm going to prove otherwise." Over the next few days, I meticulously prepared. I reviewed every mortgage payment I had ever made, every improvement to the house I had funded, every utility bill I had handled. I knew the small-town bank managers personally, people who knew me, respected me, and owed me a favor or two after decades of loyalty. Meanwhile, Jacob continued his little performances. One morning, I walked past him as he tried to inspect the basement renovations I had done years ago. He didn't even glance at me, pretending I was invisible. Laura was on the phone, gossiping with friends about how inept I had become. Every insult, every sneer, only fueled the fire inside me. I started subtly reminding the community of my presence. I ran errands at the local diner, smiled politely at neighbors, exchanged small talk, all while planting seeds. People noticed. They remembered who had built this town in small ways, who had worked nights to support families, who had quietly kept Cedar Falls humming while others plotted their schemes. Then came the real planning. I enlisted a second lawyer, a young associate who was sharp, meticulous, and eager. Together, we mapped out the exact path to reclaim not only the house, but the pride and respect that had been stolen. Every legal loophole, every procedural advantage, mapped. I even drafted notices that, at the right moment, would shock Jacob and Laura into disbelief. Late one night, I sat in the study with all the papers spread out like a battle plan. I thought about Jacob as a boy, about the times he had looked to me for guidance. Somewhere along the way, Laura's influence had poisoned him, and he had forgotten the father who had raised him, fed him, and fought for him. But that boy's missteps were irrelevant now. The man who had built everything, the father, the husband, the provider, was back in control. And then the perfect opportunity presented itself. I overheard Jacob and Laura discussing a trip to the bank to finalize some house insurance claim, oblivious that I had already taken steps to ensure that the documents they relied upon were now useless without my signature. Their arrogance blinded them completely. They thought they had anticipated my moves, but I had been anticipating theirs for weeks. I smiled as I watched them argue about which day to go, completely unaware that their plan was about to unravel. Cedar Falls had a long memory, and the town would remember this reversal. When the bank realized whose name was truly on the deed, whose payments had kept the house afloat, and whose legal filings were valid, Jacob and Laura would understand that arrogance has a cost. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence settle around me. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm, a sense of control. Revenge was not about rage. It was about restoring balance, about ensuring that justice was clear, undeniable, and unforgettable. The final confrontation wasn't far off. I could feel it, smell it in the cool autumn air, taste it in the bitter coffee. And when it came, Jacob and Laura wouldn't just lose. They would witness firsthand the quiet power of a man they had underestimated. The plan was in motion. The first domino had already tipped. And soon, very soon, the reckoning would begin. The morning of the confrontation felt electric. Cedar Falls seemed to hold its breath as I stepped into the bank lobby, my briefcase in hand, the smell of polished wood and fresh paperwork filling my senses. Jacob and Laura were already inside, arguing quietly with a bank officer, thinking they were in control. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Jacob hissed when he saw me. His voice carried a mixture of disbelief and fear, though he tried to mask it. I smiled calmly, letting the tension linger. "I came to remind you of a few facts," I said, voice steady, measured. "The deed is still in my name, the mortgage payments were mine, and the house? Well, it has always been mine." Laura's eyes widened, and she stammered, What do you mean?" You thought you could rewrite history," I interrupted. "But history has witnesses, paperwork, and signatures. Let's see if your insurance claim survives the truth." I handed the bank officer a folder, thick with receipts, legal filings, and notarized statements. The officer, a man I had known for 20 years, flipped through the documents, eyebrows raising higher with every page. "Mr. Reynolds," he said finally, voice tight, "these filings, they're all correct, and they clearly show you as the rightful owner of the property." Jacob turned pale. That's impossible," he shouted. "We did all the paperwork, the insurance, everything." "Everything you thought counted," I said quietly, "didn't. You underestimated one thing, me." The officer nodded, and Laura's face drained of color. She tried to argue, but her words faltered under the weight of undeniable proof. The murmurs in the bank grew as customers realized the drama unfolding before them. A few neighbors peeked in from the teller windows, whispering among themselves, already sensing the poetic justice in motion. "You see," I continued, "the house, the mortgage, even your so-called claim, it all hinges on what's real and what's earned. I earned this. You only assumed." Jacob's hands shook. He tried one last desperate attempt. "Dad, we can work something out. Please, don't humiliate us here." I shook my head, slowly, savoring the moment. "Humiliation? No. This isn't humiliation. It's justice. You and Laura chose arrogance over respect, lies over truth. And now, the consequences are unavoidable." The bank officer finalized the paperwork. Every document bore my signature, every record confirming that the house, the legacy, and the dignity were mine. The room was silent except for the soft scratching of pens and the faint hum of the air conditioning. As we left the bank, neighbors and friends started whispering, sharing the story through Cedar Falls' streets faster than any rumor. Jacob and Laura walked behind me, heads down, faces pale, realizing the community now saw them as the villains they had become. Back at the house, I stood on the porch, inhaling the crisp autumn air. For years, I had sacrificed everything: time, money, sleep, and pride, for a family that had almost destroyed me. But today, the tables had turned. Today, justice had been served in the quiet, inevitable way it always does, for those who wait and plan. Jacob muttered something under his breath, something I couldn't quite hear. Laura tried to argue again, but I ignored them. There was no need for shouting. The truth had spoken, and it was louder than any insult. The house, the diner, my dignity, they were mine. And I felt a calm, overwhelming sense of victory, not just for the financial win, but for reclaiming what had been stripped away: respect, honor, and peace. For the first time in weeks, I smiled genuinely. Cedar Falls had witnessed the fall of arrogance and the rise of quiet resilience. The lesson was clear, and poetic justice had been served: swift, silent, and unforgettable. And somewhere deep inside, I knew that Jacob and Laura would never forget this day. Not the humiliation, not the revelation, not the sheer weight of what they had lost because of their own arrogance. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden light across the house I had fought for, a house that now felt more like home than ever before. I closed the front door gently behind me, knowing that peace, real, earned peace, was finally mine. Morning after the bank confrontation, Cedar Falls felt different, quieter, yet heavier with whispers. Neighbors exchanged glances as I walked down Main Street, carrying the calm satisfaction of a man who had reclaimed not just his house, but his dignity. Jacob and Laura had stayed inside, avoiding anyone who might stare, whisper, or remember the truth. I paused outside the diner I had run for decades. The familiar smell of coffee and frying bacon greeted me, and I realized something important. Victory isn't just about winning, it's about returning to what matters. The diner, the house, the town, they were my life, and now I could enjoy them without fear or insult. Jacob came to the door reluctantly, trying to speak through a mixture of guilt and defiance. "Dad!" I held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "No, you don't get to apologize for the choices you made. But you will remember today. Cedar Falls will remember today. And I hope you learn from it." Laura appeared behind him, attempting to muster some last defense. But the look in her eyes betrayed her. They knew they had lost. Not just the house, not just their claim, but the respect of everyone who knew the story. The poetic justice wasn't about humiliation alone. It was about accountability. They had tried to rewrite history, steal what wasn't theirs, and belittle a man who had given them everything. And now, the truth had spoken louder than any insult. I walked back into the house, the autumn sunlight spilling across the polished floors. Each corner felt familiar, each creak of the wood a reminder of decades of hard work, sacrifice, and love. I closed the door and let myself breathe fully for the first time in months. Later that evening, I sat on the porch, watching the golden sunset over Cedar Falls. The wind rustled the leaves, carrying with it a sense of closure. Justice had been served, not in rage, not in violence, but through patience, strategy, and unwavering resolve. I thought about Jacob and Laura, and I realized something important. I didn't need their approval. Their arrogance had tried to overshadow my life, but it had failed. And now I had peace. I had dignity. I had the home I had earned with my own hands and the respect of those who mattered. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I whispered to myself, "This is the life I built. This is the life I fought for. And no one will take it from me again." In Cedar Falls, whispers of the story lingered for weeks. The tale of a father, underestimated by his own family, who calmly and brilliantly reclaimed everything he deserved, became a quiet legend. People nodded knowingly when they saw me around town, a silent acknowledgement of resilience, justice, and the power of patience. And I knew, deep in my heart, that sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't loud or violent. It's the quiet restoration of what is rightfully yours, the dignity regained, and the peace that follows the storm. I smiled, feeling the wind on my face, and for the first time in years, I felt completely free. Tell us your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories.